Welcome to Love Lies Chronicles.
For 3 days, my wife gave me the silent treatment. On day 4, she learned I no longer cared. Her silence had crowned my victory. It began on a Monday evening at exactly 6:15 p.m. I remember the precise time because I was checking my watch, wondering if I was late getting home from work. But when I walked through our front door and called out my usual greeting, the silence that greeted me wasn't the comfortable quiet of an empty house. It was something else entirely, deliberate, weighted, purposeful. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, fingers moving across the keyboard with more force than necessary. Each keystroke seemed to punctuate the absence of her usual, "How was your day?" or "Dinner's almost ready." Instead, when I approached and repeated my hello, she continued typing as if I hadn't spoken at all. "Long day?" I asked, setting my briefcase down and loosening my tie. Nothing. Not even a glance in my direction. I stood there for a moment, genuinely puzzled. In 12 years of marriage, Sarah had never been one to hold back when something was bothering her. If anything, she was the opposite, ready to discuss, analyze, and resolve any issue the moment it arose. This complete silence was so unlike her that my first thought was that something must be seriously wrong. "Sarah?" I tried again, this time moving closer and gently touching her shoulder. She didn't flinch or pull away, but she didn't acknowledge the touch either. It was as if I had become invisible in my own home. I spent the next 2 hours trying to decode what I might have done wrong. Had I forgotten something important? I mentally reviewed the past week, checking off anniversaries, birthdays, important dates. Nothing stood out. Had I said something that offended her? Our last conversation that morning had been perfectly normal: coffee, weather, plans for the weekend. By 8 p.m., when she prepared dinner for one person and sat down to eat without so much as glancing in my direction, I was moving from confusion to concern. This wasn't anger in any form I recognized. Angry Sarah would have slammed cabinet doors, given me pointed looks, or made cutting remarks. This Sarah was operating as if I simply didn't exist. "This is getting ridiculous," I said, sitting across from her at the table. "If I did something wrong, just tell me what it is and we can fix it." She chewed her salad methodically, scrolled through her phone, and continued her performance of perfect indifference. When she finished eating, she washed her single plate, left mine dirty in the sink, and walked upstairs. That first night was the longest I'd experienced in years. I lay in bed next to someone who was physically present but emotionally absent, trying to understand what had shifted in our relationship so dramatically. She went through her entire nighttime routine: shower, skincare, reading, without acknowledging my presence once. When I tried to initiate conversation, she simply turned off her bedside lamp and rolled away. I barely slept, my mind racing through possibilities, explanations, solutions. By morning, I was exhausted and frustrated, but still operating under the assumption that this was about something I had done and something I could fix. Tuesday morning brought no relief. She got up, dressed for work, and prepared to leave without a single word. I followed her to the kitchen, determined to break through whatever wall she'd constructed. "Sarah, this has gone on long enough. Whatever's wrong, we need to talk about it." She poured coffee into her travel mug, gathered her purse and keys, and headed for the door. "I'm serious," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You can't just ignore me indefinitely. This isn't solving anything." The sound of the front door closing was her only response. At work that day, I found myself distracted, playing amateur psychologist as I tried to understand my wife's behavior. I even called her office around lunchtime, but her assistant said she was in meetings all day. Whether that was true or whether Sarah had instructed her to say that, I couldn't be sure. When I arrived home Tuesday evening, I was greeted by the same calculated indifference. But this time, I noticed something different in her behavior. There was a performative quality to her silence, a deliberateness that seemed almost strategic. She was sitting in the living room reading a magazine, but I caught her watching me from the corner of her eye as I walked through the room. When I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, she turned the pages more forcefully than necessary. When I picked up the remote to check the news, she sighed audibly, her first vocal sound in over 24 hours. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about anything I had done wrong. This was about something she was trying to accomplish. She wasn't ignoring me because she was hurt or angry or upset. She was ignoring me because she was testing me, measuring me, waiting for some specific response. The realization was like a switch flipping in my brain. For the past 30 hours, I had been dancing to music only she could hear, desperately trying to solve a puzzle she had created. I had been giving her exactly what she wanted: my anxiety, my confusion, my desperate attempts to win back her attention. "I see what this is," I said aloud, not really expecting a response. "You want me to chase after you, to beg for your attention, to prove how much I need you to acknowledge my existence." She didn't respond, but the slight tension in her shoulders told me I had hit close to the mark. "Well, I'm not going to do that," I continued, settling back into the couch. "If you want to act like I don't exist, that's your choice. But I'm not going to exhaust myself trying to force you to behave like an adult." For the first time in 2 days, I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't being punished for some unknown transgression. I was being manipulated, and manipulation only worked when the target cooperated with the manipulation. I ordered pizza that night, something Sarah hated but I enjoyed. When it arrived, I didn't offer to share or ask if she wanted anything. I sat at the kitchen table, ate my dinner in peace, and actually found myself relaxing for the first time since this whole ordeal began. She came into the kitchen while I was eating, clearly expecting me to offer her some food or at least acknowledge her presence. When I continued eating and reading my book without looking up, I could practically feel her confusion. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. After dinner, I took a long shower, put on comfortable clothes, and settled in to watch a movie I'd been wanting to see, one that Sarah had always dismissed as stupid action garbage. Without her commentary or subtle signs of disapproval, I found myself actually enjoying it. When she came downstairs and saw me laughing at the screen, completely absorbed in my entertainment, she stood in the doorway for several minutes. I could feel her staring, waiting for me to notice her, to invite her to join me, to somehow bridge the gap she had created. But I was genuinely enjoying myself, and her presence wasn't necessary for my happiness. That second night, I slept better than I had in months. No tension, no anxiety, no mental gymnastics trying to figure out what was wrong. Just peace. Wednesday morning marked a shift in her strategy. She came downstairs earlier than usual, dressed in an outfit I'd always complimented, and spent extra time in the kitchen, obviously hoping I'd notice her efforts. When I poured my coffee and headed to the garage to work on a project before leaving for work, without so much as glancing in her direction, her frustration was palpable. I spent that morning organizing my workshop, something I'd been meaning to do for months, but never had the uninterrupted time to tackle. Without the usual morning conversation, the gentle questioning about my plans, or the subtle requests for attention, I was remarkably productive. When I came back inside to grab my briefcase, she was still in the kitchen, obviously waiting for some kind of interaction. She had prepared an elaborate breakfast, something she rarely did on weekdays, and was eating it very slowly, clearly performing for an audience of one. I walked past her, collected my things, and headed for work without a word. In my rearview mirror, I could see her standing at the window, watching me drive away with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but something closer to panic. At work that day, I realized something remarkable. I felt lighter, more focused, more energetic than I had in years. Without the constant low-level anxiety of managing Sarah's emotions, anticipating her needs, or walking on eggshells around her moods, my mind was clear and sharp. I called my friend Mike during lunch and suggested we grab drinks after work, something I hadn't done in months because it usually involved negotiations with Sarah about timing, duration, and whether I was abandoning her for my friends. Just like that, Mike asked, surprised. "No checking with the missus first?" "Not necessary," I said, and meant it. That evening, I came home to find Sarah in full performance mode. She had cleaned the house thoroughly, prepared an elaborate dinner, and was wearing the dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year. The table was set for two, candles were lit, and she was obviously expecting this gesture to break down whatever resistance I'd built up. I looked at the scene she'd created, nodded appreciatively, and then walked to the refrigerator to grab a beer. "Mike and I are grabbing drinks," I announced to the kitchen in general. "Don't wait up." The sound she made behind me was somewhere between a gasp and a growl of frustration. I could feel her staring at me in disbelief as I collected my keys and wallet. This elaborate dinner, this obvious peace offering, this careful staging, none of it had generated even a moment's hesitation from me. At the bar with Mike, I found myself laughing more than I had in months. Without the constant mental background noise of worrying about Sarah's mood or wondering what I might have done wrong, I was actually present in the conversation, engaged and relaxed. "You seem different tonight," Mike observed. "More like yourself." "I feel more like myself," I admitted, and realized it was true. When I came home around 10 o'clock, the elaborate dinner had been cleaned up, and Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I found her upstairs in bed, obviously not asleep, clearly waiting for me to come up and finally address the elephant in the room. Instead, I brushed my teeth, got into bed, and went to sleep without saying a word. I could feel her lying there, rigid with frustration, probably staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how her carefully planned evening had gone so completely wrong. Thursday morning brought desperation. She was up before me, making noise in the kitchen that was obviously designed to wake me up earlier than usual. When I came downstairs, she had prepared coffee exactly the way I liked it and was standing by the coffee maker, clearly waiting for some acknowledgement of her effort. I poured my coffee, added cream, and took a sip. It was perfect as always. But instead of thanking her or commenting on the gesture, I simply nodded and headed outside to read the newspaper on the porch. Through the window, I could see her standing at the kitchen counter, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her own coffee mug. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked genuinely upset rather than strategically manipulative. But I had learned something important over the past 3 days. I didn't need her approval to feel good about myself. I didn't need her attention to feel valued. I didn't need her acknowledgement to feel worthy of respect. These were lessons I should have learned years ago, but it had taken her complete withdrawal for me to discover my own emotional independence. At work that day, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. I accepted an invitation to a weekend golf tournament that Sarah had always found ways to make me decline. When my colleague asked if I needed to check with my wife first, I simply said, "No need. I'll be there." That evening, I came home to find Sarah in what I can only describe as controlled chaos. She was rearranging furniture in the living room, moving things around with obvious frustration, clearly trying to create some kind of situation that would force me to comment or participate. I walked through the room, noting the changes but saying nothing. When she moved a heavy bookshelf and obviously struggled with it, I didn't offer to help. In the past, I would have immediately jumped in, worried about her hurting herself or damaging the furniture. But this was clearly another performance designed to elicit a response, and I wasn't interested in playing along. She eventually gave up on the furniture rearrangement and tried a new tactic. She started talking on the phone with her sister, loud enough for me to hear every word, obviously performing for my benefit. "I don't know what's wrong with him," she said, her voice carrying clearly from the kitchen to the living room where I was reading. "He's been acting so strange lately, so cold and distant. I'm starting to worry that something's seriously wrong." I almost laughed at the irony. Here she was, 3 days into giving me the complete silent treatment, telling someone else that I was being cold and distant. The lack of self-awareness was stunning. "Maybe he's having some kind of breakdown," she continued, her voice getting louder. "Or maybe he's going through something at work. I just don't know what to do anymore." When that didn't generate a response, she tried escalating the drama. "I'm starting to think he might be having an affair," she said, obviously hoping this accusation would force me to defend myself. I turned the page of my book and continued reading. That night, she attempted what I assumed was her nuclear option. She came to bed wearing lingerie I hadn't seen in months, clearly expecting that physical attraction would break down whatever wall I'd built between us. She positioned herself in bed in a way that was obviously meant to get my attention, then made a show of applying lotion to her legs, taking much longer than necessary and making sure I could see every movement. In the past, this display would have worked. I would have been drawn into conversation, into physical contact, into the kind of interaction that would have given her back the control she was seeking. Instead, I set my alarm, turned off my bedside light, and went to sleep. I could feel her lying there in disbelief, probably staring at me in the dark, trying to understand how her most reliable tactics had become completely ineffective. Friday morning brought a new level of panic from her. She was moving around the house with frantic energy, starting projects and abandoning them, picking up her phone and putting it down repeatedly, checking her appearance in every mirror she passed. She was also watching me constantly, studying my face for any sign that I was weakening. that her strategy was finally starting to work, that I was missing her attention and ready to come crawling back. But I wasn't weakening. If anything, I was getting stronger. The past 4 days had been a revelation. I had rediscovered what it felt like to live without constantly monitoring someone else's emotional state, without walking on eggshells, without having my peace of mind depend entirely on someone else's mood. I was sleeping better, eating better, more productive at work, more social with friends. I was reading books I'd been meaning to read, working on projects I'd been putting off, having conversations I'd been avoiding. In trying to punish me with her silence, Sarah had actually given me the greatest gift possible: freedom from the need for her approval. That evening, she made one final attempt at regaining control. She started crying, not the genuine tears of someone who was actually upset, but the calculated crying of someone who was used to tears being an effective tool for getting what she wanted. She sat on the couch sobbing dramatically, clearly waiting for me to rush over and ask what was wrong, to comfort her, to somehow take responsibility for her emotional state. I glanced over, assessed that she wasn't in any actual distress, and went back to watching television. The crying stopped almost immediately. She looked at me with an expression of complete disbelief, as if I had broken some fundamental rule of marriage by not responding to her performance. "Are you serious right now?" she said, breaking her self-imposed silence for the first time in almost 72 hours. I looked at her calmly. "Are you talking to me now?" "I wasn't sure, since you've been pretending I don't exist for the past 3 days. "I was making a point," she said, her voice rising. "And what point was that?" "That you take me for granted. That you don't appreciate me. That you need to realize how much you need me." I nodded slowly, processing her admission. "And how did that work out for you?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling with the answer. "I'm waiting," I said patiently. "You're being cruel," she finally said. "I'm being honest. You wanted to show me how much I needed your attention, your approval, your acknowledgement. Well, mission accomplished. You showed me exactly how much I needed." "Which is, not at all." The words hung in the air between us. I could see the exact moment when she realized that her strategy had backfired completely, that instead of making me desperate for her attention, she had freed me from the need for it entirely. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. These past 3 days have been the most peaceful I've had in years. No drama, no emotional manipulation, no walking on eggshells trying to figure out what mood you're in or what I've supposedly done wrong. Just peace." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process this information, trying to figure out how to regain the upper hand in a situation where she had completely lost control. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now you decide whether you want to be in a relationship with someone who won't tolerate emotional games, silent treatments, or manipulation tactics. Because that's who I am now. The person who spent 3 days chasing after you, desperate for your attention, worried about what he'd done wrong. He's gone." "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it did happen, and now we both know the truth." The truth was simple and devastating. In trying to show me how much I needed her, she had shown me how much better my life could be without constantly catering to her emotional needs. Her silence, intended as punishment, had become my liberation. Her withdrawal, meant to make me desperate, had made me independent. She had played a game she was certain she would win, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the rules. She had assumed I would break under the pressure of her silence, that I would come crawling back begging for her attention and approval. Instead, I had discovered something I hadn't known about myself. I was perfectly capable of being happy without her constant validation. I could function, thrive even, without needing to manage her emotions or walk on eggshells around her moods. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally. "Maybe it doesn't need to be fixed," I replied. "Maybe it just needs to be different." As I looked at her sitting there on the couch, no longer the confident manipulator who had started this game 3 days ago, but someone who was genuinely shaken by how completely her strategy had backfired, I realized that her silence had indeed crowned my victory. Not a victory over her, but a victory over the version of myself that had allowed emotional manipulation to dictate the quality of my days. The version that had walked on eggshells, constantly worried about approval, and measured my worth by someone else's mood. 3 days of silence had taught me what years of marriage hadn't. that I was complete on my own, that I didn't need anyone else's permission to be happy, and that the most powerful response to manipulation was simply refusing to participate. Her silent treatment was over, but my transformation was just beginning. Over the weekend, she attempted what I can only describe as a full-scale campaign to restore the previous dynamic. Saturday morning, she woke up early and prepared an elaborate breakfast, complete with fresh flowers on the table and my favorite coffee blend. She moved around the kitchen with exaggerated cheerfulness, humming softly and glancing at me expectantly every few minutes. "I thought we could spend the day together," she said brightly, as if the past 3 days had been some minor misunderstanding rather than a calculated campaign of emotional manipulation. "Maybe drive to that antique market you mentioned wanting to visit?" I looked up from my newspaper. The antique market had been her idea, not mine. She had been trying to get me to go there for months, and I had repeatedly declined because I found antique shopping tedious. But in her revised version of reality, it was something I had wanted to do. "I'm playing golf today," I said simply, returning to my reading. Her face fell slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, well, maybe we could do something when you get back. I could make that dinner you like. Open a nice bottle of wine." Again, the dinner she was referring to was something she enjoyed, not me. But she was trying to rewrite our history to make it seem like I was the one being accommodated. "I'll probably be tired when I get back," I said. Long day on the course. The golf tournament turned out to be exactly what I needed. 18 holes of peaceful competition with friends who didn't require me to constantly monitor their emotional state or decode their hidden meanings. When someone was frustrated with their game, they said so directly. When someone was happy with a good shot, they celebrated openly. No passive-aggressive behavior, no silent treatments, no emotional manipulation. "You seem different today," my golf partner Tom commented as we walked to the next tee. "More relaxed." "I feel more relaxed," I admitted. "Everything okay at home?" I considered how to answer that question. Everything wasn't okay at home, but it also wasn't my problem to fix anymore. "Sarah and I are working through some things," I said finally. "Marriage is tough," Tom said sympathetically. "But you two always seemed solid." "We're figuring out what solid actually means," I replied. When I came home that evening, Sarah had prepared the elaborate dinner she'd mentioned, complete with candles and wine. She had also changed into a dress I'd always complimented, done her hair, and was clearly expecting this gesture to bridge whatever gap had opened between us. "How was golf?" she asked as I walked through the door, her voice carefully modulated to sound casually interested rather than desperately eager for conversation. "Good," I said, hanging up my jacket. "Shot an 86. "That's great," she said with enthusiasm that seemed slightly forced. "Dinner's ready whenever you are." I made that salmon dish with the lemon butter sauce. The salmon dish was something she had seen in a cooking magazine and wanted to try. I had never expressed any particular interest in it, but she was continuing her campaign to rewrite our preferences and make it seem like she was constantly doing things for my benefit. I looked at the elaborate table setting, the carefully prepared meal, the obvious effort she had put into creating what she probably saw as a romantic evening. In the past, I would have felt obligated to participate, to appreciate her efforts, to pretend that this gesture somehow erased the past 3 days of emotional manipulation. "I'm not really hungry," I said. "I grabbed something at the clubhouse." That wasn't entirely true. I had only had a beer and some pretzels, but I wasn't interested in participating in her carefully orchestrated reconciliation scene. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, anger, and then something that looked almost like panic. This was supposed to work. The elaborate dinner, the romantic setting, the obvious effort. These had always been reliable tools for getting back into my good graces after any kind of conflict. "But I spent all afternoon cooking," she said, her voice taking on a slight edge. "I didn't ask you to," I replied gently but firmly. Those 5 words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She had operated for years under the assumption that her efforts on my behalf, whether requested or not, created a debt that I was obligated to repay with attention, gratitude, and forgiveness. The idea that I might not feel indebted to her efforts had clearly never occurred to her. Sunday brought a new level of desperation. She woke up early and spent the morning cleaning the house with an intensity that bordered on frantic. She scrubbed surfaces that were already clean, organized closets that were already organized, and made enough noise to ensure I was aware of her activity. When I came downstairs to make coffee, she was on her hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor, something she normally did only when we were expecting company. "You don't need to do that," I said, stepping carefully around her to reach the coffee maker. "It needed to be done," she said without looking up, her voice carrying a martyred tone that was clearly meant to make me feel guilty for not appreciating her sacrifice. But I didn't feel guilty. I felt annoyed that she was using household chores as a form of emotional manipulation, trying to create a sense of obligation through exaggerated effort. After coffee, I went to my workshop in the garage to continue organizing my tools. It was a project I'd been putting off for months, but the past few days had given me the uninterrupted time to tackle it properly. I was making real progress, creating systems that would make future projects more efficient. Around noon, Sarah appeared in the doorway of the garage, clearly expecting me to stop what I was doing and give her my attention. "I was thinking we could go to lunch somewhere," she said. "That new place downtown you mentioned wanting to try?" Once again, she was attributing her own interests to me. The new restaurant downtown served the kind of fusion cuisine she enjoyed, but I had never expressed any interest in trying it. "I'm busy," I said, not looking up from the toolbox I was organizing. "You've been busy all weekend," she said, and I could hear the frustration creeping into her voice. "I've been productive," I corrected. "There's a difference." She stood there for a moment, clearly struggling with how to respond to my refusal to engage with her emotional manipulation. "We need to talk," she said finally. "Do we?" I asked, still focused on my tools. "Yes, we do. This whole, whatever this is, it needs to stop." I looked up at her then, really looked at her. She was standing in the doorway of my workshop with her arms crossed, her face set in an expression of determination that didn't quite hide the uncertainty underneath. She had spent the past 4 days trying every tool in her manipulation toolkit, and none of them had worked. Now she was resorting to direct confrontation, probably hoping that a serious conversation would allow her to regain some control over the situation. "What needs to stop?" I asked. "This attitude. This coldness. This pretending like everything is normal when it obviously isn't." "Everything is normal," I said. "This is just what normal looks like when one person stops managing another person's emotions." "I don't know what that means," she said, but her voice suggested she knew exactly what it meant and didn't like it. "It means I'm not responsible for your feelings anymore. It means I'm not going to chase after you when you're upset. It means I'm not going to decode your hidden messages or try to fix problems you haven't directly communicated to me. It means I'm going to live my life without constantly monitoring your emotional state." She stared at me for a long moment. "So you're just done with our marriage?" "I'm done with the version of our marriage where your moods control my day, where I have to walk on eggshells to avoid setting off some emotional landmine, where I'm constantly trying to prove that I care enough, pay attention enough, appreciate you enough. That version is over. And what's the alternative?" "The alternative is a relationship between two adults who are responsible for their own emotions, who communicate directly instead of through games and manipulation, who don't use withdrawal and silence as weapons." "I wasn't using silence as a weapon," she protested. I raised an eyebrow. "Really? Then what would you call 3 days of complete refusal to acknowledge my existence?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. We both knew exactly what it had been. "I was trying to make a point," she said finally. "And what point was that? That you take me for granted. That you don't notice when I'm upset. That you need to pay more attention to me." "And did it work?" Another long pause. "Obviously not. Right? Because the point you actually made was that I'm perfectly capable of being happy without your attention. That I don't need your approval to feel good about myself. That I can function just fine when you're not constantly requiring me to manage your emotions." She looked like I had slapped her. The idea that she might not be as necessary to my happiness as she had assumed was clearly devastating to her. "I don't require you to manage my emotions," she said weakly. "Sarah, you gave me the silent treatment for 3 days because you felt I wasn't paying enough attention to you. How is that not requiring me to manage your emotions?" She had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. "So where does that leave us?" she asked quietly. "That's up to you," I said, returning to my tool organization. "You can either accept that this is who I am now, someone who won't tolerate emotional manipulation, or you can decide that's not the kind of relationship you want." "You're different," she said, and there was something almost like fear in her voice. "I'm better," I corrected. "These past few days have shown me what it feels like to live without constantly worrying about someone else's emotional state. I'm sleeping better, I'm more productive, I'm happier. Your silent treatment didn't punish me, it liberated me." She turned and walked back into the house without another word, leaving me alone in the garage with my thoughts and my tools. That evening, she made one final attempt to restore the old dynamic. She came downstairs wearing a nightgown I hadn't seen in months, clearly hoping that physical intimacy would somehow reset our relationship back to its previous state. "I miss you," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed where I was reading. "I'm right here," I replied without looking up from my book. "No, you're not. Not really. You're here physically, but you're distant." "I'm not distant. I'm just not chasing after your approval anymore." "Is that what you think I want? For you to chase after my approval?" I looked at her then. "Sarah, you gave me 3 days of complete silence because you felt I wasn't paying enough attention to you. What would you call that if not demanding that I chase after your approval?" She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her processing this characterization of her behavior. "I just wanted you to notice me," she said finally. "I notice you. I've always noticed you. But I'm not going to panic every time you're in a mood. I'm not going to turn myself inside out trying to figure out what I've done wrong when you haven't told me anything is wrong. And I'm definitely not going to participate in emotional games designed to test how much I care about you. So what do you want from me? I want you to communicate like an adult. I want you to say what you mean instead of expecting me to guess. I want you to be responsible for your own emotions instead of making them my problem to solve. And if I can't do that, then you can't do that," I said simply. "But I won't go back to the way things were before." She sat there for a while longer, clearly hoping I would soften, would give her some sign that the old dynamic was still available if she just found the right approach. But I was done being the kind of person who managed other people's emotions, who walked on eggshells, who measured his worth by someone else's approval. Her 3 days of silence had been intended as a punishment, a way to show me how much I needed her attention and validation. Instead, it had been the most valuable gift she could have given me. The discovery that I was complete on my own, that I didn't need anyone else's permission to be happy, and that the most powerful response to emotional manipulation was simply refusing to play the game. Monday morning brought a return to our routine, but with a fundamental shift in the underlying dynamic. She made coffee and attempted casual conversation, but there was a carefulness in her manner that hadn't been there before. She was testing the waters, trying to figure out the new rules of engagement. "How did you sleep?" she asked as I poured my coffee. "Fine," I replied. "Any plans for today after work?" "The usual." She was clearly hoping for more expansive answers, more engagement, more of the detailed conversation that had characterized our mornings before her 3-day experiment in manipulation. But I wasn't interested in pretending that nothing had changed. As I prepared to leave for work, she made one more attempt. "Maybe we could have dinner together tonight. Actually sit down and talk? If you have something you want to discuss, we can discuss it," I said. "But I'm not interested in manufactured conversation designed to restore the status quo." She looked hurt by that, but also, I thought, a little relieved. For the first time in our relationship, I had been completely direct about my expectations and boundaries. There was no guesswork involved, no need for her to decode hidden meanings or figure out what I really wanted. At work that day, I found myself reflecting on how much energy I had been devoting to managing Sarah's emotions. The constant mental background process of monitoring her mood, anticipating her needs, and adjusting my behavior to avoid triggering her dissatisfaction had been exhausting in ways I hadn't fully realized. Without that burden, I was more present in my work, more engaged with my colleagues, more creative in my problem solving. Several people commented on my improved mood and energy level. "You seem really good lately," my assistant mentioned during our weekly check-in. "More, I don't know, focused." "I feel more focused," I admitted. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." What I was doing was simple. I was living my life without constantly worrying about someone else's emotional state. I was making decisions based on my own preferences and needs rather than trying to anticipate and accommodate someone else's unspoken expectations. I was, for the first time in years, truly myself. That evening, Sarah tried a different approach. Instead of elaborate gestures or manipulative behavior, she simply asked directly for what she wanted. "I'd like us to have dinner together tonight," she said when I came home from work. "Just the two of us, at the table, with conversation." "Okay," I said. She looked surprised by my easy agreement. "Really? You asked for something directly, instead of expecting me to guess what you wanted or trying to manipulate me into it?" "Yes, really." Over dinner, she made an effort to engage in genuine conversation rather than the passive-aggressive communication that had characterized our interactions for years. She asked about my work, listened to my answers, and shared information about her own day without any hidden agenda or expectation that I solve her problems. It was, I realized, the first honest conversation we'd had in months. "This is better," she said as we cleaned up the dishes together. "It is," I agreed. I didn't realize how complicated things had gotten between us. "They don't have to be complicated." "I don't know how to not be complicated," she admitted. "Start by saying what you mean. When you're upset about something, say you're upset, and say why. When you want something, ask for it directly. When you're happy, say you're happy. Stop expecting me to read your mind. What if you don't like what I have to say? Then I don't like it. But at least we'll both know where we stand." It was a small step, but it was progress. The woman who had tried to control me with 3 days of silence was beginning to understand that direct communication was more effective than manipulation. But the real test would come the next time she was upset about something. Would she revert to her old patterns of passive-aggressive behavior and emotional manipulation, or would she remember the lesson of the past few days, that I was no longer willing to participate in those games? Only time would tell. But regardless of what she chose to do, I knew who I was now. I was someone who didn't need anyone else's approval to be happy, who wouldn't tolerate emotional manipulation, and who had learned that the most powerful response to silence used as a weapon was to discover that I didn't need the conversation to begin with. Her 3 days of silence had indeed crowned my victory. Not a victory over her, but a victory over the version of myself that had allowed manipulation to control my happiness. And that was a lesson I would never forget.
Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.